is a precise frequency at which a human mind begins to crack. And the architects of the Cold War knew the exact dial to tune it to. It doesn't sound like screaming. It sounds like absolute silence, the kind you find inside a soundproofed concrete bunker, 3 stories beneath an ordinary suburban house, where the air smells faintly of copper and industrial bleach. If you stood inside that room in the autumn of 1951, you wouldn't see chains or iron bars. You would see a comfortable armchair, a warm reading lamp, and a man staring blankly at a wall, completely unaware that his own childhood had been systematically unzipped and removed from his skull like a parasite pulled from a wound. This is where the architecture of free will collapses. Before the world ever learned to whisper the name MKUltra, the Central Intelligence Agency was running a far more surgical, far more intimate nightmare known as Project Artichoke. Its purpose wasn't interrogation. Interrogation assumes you have secrets worth hiding. Artichoke operated on a much darker premise, that a human being could be entirely hollowed out, their memories scrubbed clean to the studs, and rebuilt from the ground up as a living weapon that didn't even know it was armed. The official history claims these files were destroyed, shredded in panic before congressional investigators could turn the key. But ink on paper can be burned. The structural damage left inside the human psyche cannot. Listen closely to the quiet hum of the room you are sitting in right now, because as you pull the darkness in around you for the next 10 chapters, we are going to look down into the well of what the human government did when it decided that your mind was no longer your own. Welcome to Halfway Dark. Let us begin the descent. To understand how you dismantle a human life without leaving a single fingerprint, you have to look past the cold steel of the interrogation table and into the chemistry of the quiet room. By 1951, the architects of Project Artichoke had realized that brute force interrogation was a clumsy, inefficient tool. It left behind structural trauma, psychological resistance, and a mind that fought back even as it fractured. What the agency wanted was cleaner, more surgical, and entirely absolute. They were not interested in what you knew. They were interested in making sure you no longer knew who you were. They turned their focus to the subtle, chilling art of cognitive erasure, operating under the terrifying hypothesis that the human ego is not a solid foundation, but a house built on shifting sand. If you introduce the right chemical compound, a precise synthetic cocktail engineered to dissolve the barriers between the conscious mind and the suggestion box of the subconscious, the sand simply washes away, leaving nothing behind to anchor the soul to reality. In unlisted safehouses scattered quietly across the American landscape, doctors working under classified black budget mandates began administering massive doses of modified barbiturates, heavy scopolamine derivatives, and early experimental hallucinogens to subjects who had no idea where they were or how they had arrived. These weren't clinical trials meant to heal or understand. They were precision demolition exercises. The drugs induced an immediate, terrifying state of dissociative twilight, where the subject's defenses dissolved like mist, leaving their core identity exposed, shivering, and entirely defenseless in the dark. Imagine looking down at your own hands and being completely unable to remember what they built this morning, who taught you your name, or what face used to look back at you in the mirror. Imagine the rising, silent panic that sets in when your internal monologue begins to stutter, loop, and finally go completely blank, replaced entirely by the flat, dispassionate voice of an invisible handler whispering instructions into the dark. This was the quiet horror of the baseline phase. The human subject was stripped of their history, like meat being carved away from the bone. They were no longer a person with a family, a past, or a future. They were a blank slate, a vacant apartment waiting for a foreign tenant to move in. And the people holding the keys had no intention of ever leaving a forwarding address or letting the original owner back inside. The documents detailing these early trials were stamped with classifications so high that even high-ranking military commanders were locked out of the loop. But papers can only hide so much, and bureaucracies are terrible at burying ghosts. The real evidence isn't found in the redacted margins of a government memo. It's found in the lingering phantom echo of a self that was stolen, hollowed out, and never quite returned to its rightful owner. To build a machine capable of rewriting human consciousness, You cannot work in the open. You need absolute isolation, a vacuum where the normal rules of law, ethics, and basic human dignity cease to function. By the bitter winter of 1952, Project Artichoke expanded its dark footprint far beyond standard military installations. The agency began acquiring nondescript residential properties, rural safehouses, and urban brownstones that sat completely unnoticed, in plain sight. From the outside, these locations looked entirely ordinary: curtains drawn, mail piling up in the box, and quiet neighbors minding their own business, while history was unspooled behind closed doors. But on the inside, these houses were converted into sterile, sound-insulated laboratories, engineered for one single purpose: the systematic dismantling of the human will. This was the domain of shadowy handlers and clinical medical researchers, who viewed the human mind not as a sacred sanctuary, but as a complex mechanical lock, waiting for the right key. Windows were permanently blacked out, shuttered or sealed shut to completely sever any connection to the outside world. Doors were reinforced with heavy-duty acoustic seals to ensure that whatever sounds or screams occurred within those rooms never bled out into the neighborhood. In these controlled, airless environments, subjects were brought under false medical pretenses or covertly abducted, stripped of their personal clothing, their jewelry, and any remaining tether to their previous lives. They were assigned code numbers instead of names, instantly transforming living, breathing individuals into disposable clinical data points. The atmosphere inside these houses was deliberately engineered to induce total disorientation and psychological collapse. The lighting was kept at a constant, low-frequency hum, or the rooms were plunged into absolute, sensory-depriving pitch blackness for days at a continuous stretch, completely destroying the subject's internal clock and biological rhythm. When you can no longer track the passage of time, your grip on reality begins to loosen, like wet clay. You stop fighting, because fighting requires a stable framework of time and space, and both had been meticulously dismantled around you. In these quiet, sterile rooms, the true horror of the Cold War revealed itself. It wasn't just found in the terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation falling from the sky, but in the intimate, localized erasure of the individual soul. The state had decided that certain human minds were entirely expendable, raw material to be mined, hollowed out, and rebuilt in the name of national security. And as the research pushed deeper into the dark, the handlers realized they needed something even more sophisticated than a blank slate. They needed subjects who could be sent back out into the everyday world, carrying a hidden, dormant trigger, waiting silently for a single word, a phone call, or a specific sound to wake the sleeper agent, buried deep beneath the surface of a stolen life. Once a subject was successfully isolated inside the sterile, sound-insulated walls of a black site safe house, the next phase of Project Artichoke could begin. This was where the raw mechanics of psychological demolition transitioned from environmental disorientation to chemical coercion. The handlers knew that breaking the human being's spirit through traditional stress or sleep deprivation took precious time, and time was a luxury the intelligence community believed it did not have. They needed a chemical accelerator, a substance that could shortcut the complex defenses of the human ego and pry open the subconscious vault in a matter of hours. The search for this ultimate compliance tool led agency scientists down a deeply disturbing rabbit hole of pharmaceutical experimentation. Drawing on research inherited from wartime atrocities and clandestine domestic trials, medical researchers began testing a revolving arsenal of synthetic compounds. They administered heavy doses of intravenous barbiturates to induce a state of heavy, compliant lethargy, followed immediately by calculated injections of amphetamines to spike the nervous system into overdrive. This cruel seesaw of upper and downer chemicals left the subject's brain oscillating wildly between exhaustion and hyperarousal, rendering rational thought nearly impossible. Among the most favored tools in this pharmacological dark art was high-grade scopolamine, often referred to in intelligence circles as the breath of the devil. When introduced into the bloodstream, scopolamine strips away a person's capacity to resist suggestion or tell the difference between truth and fiction. Subjects would sit in quiet compliance, their eyes glazed over, answering any question put to them by a handler in a flat, unthinking monotone. They were awake, they were breathing, but the pilot had entirely abandoned the cockpit. Their free will had been chemically evicted, replaced by whatever directive the man with the syringe chose to plant in their hollowed-out minds. The records that survived the subsequent purges of these files paint a chilling picture of human beings treated like biological machinery. Notes scribbled in the margins of medical logs detail erratic heart rates, violent convulsions, and permanent psychological fractures that lingered long after the drugs had cleared the system. For the scientists running the program, these weren't tragic side effects. They were data points in an ongoing experiment to find out exactly how much chemical trauma a soul could absorb before it shattered completely. And as the threshold of compliance was reached, the handlers prepared to cross the final irreversible line, planting the seed of an action the subject would commit, and then completely forget ever doing. Every dark machine requires an operator, someone whose intellect is cold enough to stare directly into the abyss of human suffering without blinking. And during the early years of the Cold War, that operator was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Operating from the shadows of the CIA's Technical Services Division, Gottlieb was the quiet, unassuming chemist who authorized the darkest iterations of Project Artichoke and its successor, MK Ultra. He did not look like a monster. Contemporaries described him as a mild-mannered man who enjoyed folk dancing, raised goats, and spoke in a soft academic tone. But behind those gentle eyes lay an absolute, unyielding commitment to mastering the mechanics of human control, regardless of the ethical cost. Gottlieb viewed the human mind as a puzzle to be solved, a biological lock that could be picked with the right combination of chemistry, isolation, and psychological trauma. While other officials debated the legalities of domestic experimentation, Gottlieb pushed relentlessly for broader, more aggressive parameters. He believed that if the United States did not discover the secrets of mind control first, the Soviet bloc would achieve total cognitive dominance, leaving the free world entirely defenseless against invisible, programmed assassins. This existential fear became the moral justification for an endless series of atrocities committed behind unmarked doors and safehouses across the country. Under his direct supervision, millions of dollars were funneled into university research labs, pharmaceutical companies, and clandestine black sites under the guise of innocent medical grants. Unsuspecting patients in mental institutions, prisoners serving minor sentences, and individuals swept up off the street became unwitting guinea pigs in Gottlieb's grand design. He personally traveled to secret overseas detention facilities to observe interrogations firsthand, carrying lockboxes filled with exotic poisons, synthetic hallucinogens, and experimental serums. He wanted to see the exact moment a human personality dissolved, tracking the precise chemical dosage required to wipe a lifetime of memories clean off the slate. What makes Gottlieb's legacy so deeply unsettling is the utter bureaucratic detachment he brought to human torture. He was not driven by sadistic malice or personal anger. He was driven by cold, clinical curiosity and an obsessive dedication to national security. To him, a destroyed psyche was simply a failed experiment, and a permanently broken subject was an acceptable loss in the pursuit of absolute tactical advantage. He treated the human soul like raw industrial material, mining it for compliance and burning away the impurities until nothing was left of the original person. Yet, even the most meticulous architects of terror make mistakes, and as the 1950s drew to a close, the sprawling network of safehouses, secret dossiers, and chemically induced nightmares began to accumulate a dangerous mass of paper. The paper trail pointed directly back to the 7th floor of the CIA headquarters and to Gottlieb himself. When the political winds shifted and congressional oversight loomed on the horizon, the man who had spent a decade dismantling human memories realized he had a massive cleanup job of his own to do. But before the fires were lit to burn the evidence, the machinery of Artichoke had already accomplished its primary terrifying goal, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that a human being could be unmade entirely from the inside out. There is a terrifying leap between erasing a person's memory and actually building something functional in the smoking wreckage left behind. Wiping a mind clean with heavy sedatives and isolation is just demolition work. Anyone with enough drugs in a locked room can break a human down until they don't know their own name. But the real ambition behind Project Artichoke was much worse. They didn't just want a blank slate. They wanted a weapon that could walk around in broad daylight, look completely normal, and then execute an order it had no idea it was carrying. To pull this off, the handlers had to master the delicate art of compartmentalization. They discovered that under the right layers of deep hypnotic trance and post-hypnotic suggestion cemented by chemical coercion, a human brain could hide its own actions from itself. You take a subject, reduce them to a compliant shell, and then carefully write a new set of instructions directly into the subconscious vault. You give them a trigger phrase, a specific tone of voice, or even an innocuous visual cue like a ringing telephone or a colored card. When that trigger is pulled outside the safe house, the conscious mind goes to sleep at the wheel. The built-in safety mechanisms of human empathy, self-preservation, and moral hesitation are bypassed entirely. The subject performs the directive, whether it's delivering a package, staging a sabotage, or something far darker, and then instantly snaps back to ordinary reality. Walk away, look at your watch, wonder why your heart is hammering against your ribs, and because the conscious mind has been partitioned off from what the body just did, the subject remembers absolutely nothing. When hooked up to a lie detector test, they would pass with absolute terrifying sincerity because, as far as their conscious brain knew, they had spent the afternoon sitting quietly on a park bench. The handlers tested these theories on subjects who had been brought in under false pretenses, foreign defectors, suspected double agents, and ordinary citizens swept up by accident. They would be told to pull a gun on a trusted colleague or attempt an assassination during a mock training exercise. In the early trials, many of the subjects would hesitate, break the trance, or simply collapse in confusion. But the doctors didn't stop. They refined the cocktail, they lengthened the isolation, they tightened the psychological ties until the barrier between the real person and the programmed construct became seamless. This was the quiet nightmare of the Cold War intelligence apparatus. They weren't just spying on the enemy, they were redesigning human nature from the ground up, turning flesh and blood into a remote-controlled instrument of the state. And the most chilling part wasn't that they tried to do it. In more than a few documented instances, it actually worked. When you tear down the load-bearing walls of a human identity, what looks back at you from the wreckage is never a clean, empty room. It is a series of jagged, splintered reflections, each one screaming for a name it can no longer quite reach. By the time these subjects finally emerged from the weeks of dense chemical fog, continuous disorientation, and sensory-depriving isolation inside those hidden safe houses, the structural damage to their psyches wasn't just deep. It was fundamentally permanent. The human mind is simply not built to have its entire history unzipped, shredded, and stitched back together by nameless men in white coats, without leaving raw, bleeding edges that never truly heal. The handlers documented these psychological transformations with the cold, detached curiosity of mechanics inspecting a faulty combustion engine. They were no longer looking at human beings with families, fears, or futures. They were studying error rates, behavioral loops, and the absolute breaking points of biological endurance. Subjects who had entered the program as sharp, functional individuals, some of them foreign defectors, others ordinary citizens swept up by tragic coincidence, returned to the outside world with a hollowed-out, haunted look carved deep into their eyes. They would sit across the kitchen table from their own children or hold their spouse's hand, while a low-frequency, unnameable panic buzzed constantly at the back of their skulls. They knew with absolute certainty that something vital, something sacred, had been violently stolen from them in the dark, but the vocabulary to name the theft had been chemically scrubbed from their brains. The psychological fallout was catastrophic, yet entirely invisible to anyone passing them on the street. How do you possibly explain to a local physician that your childhood memories feel like someone else's vacation slides? How do you tell the police that you woke up in a room with no windows, yet your personal calendar and passport insist you were asleep in your own bed all week? The victims of Project Artichoke were cast entirely adrift in a reality they could no longer trust or comprehend. Every passing stranger on the sidewalk looked like a potential handler monitoring their progress. Every sudden noise or ringing phone sounded like a hidden trigger waiting to drag them back down into the green-painted basement. The agency's own internal progress memos noted these severe psychiatric casualties with dry, clinical euphemisms, writing off permanent trauma as prolonged emotional destabilization and irreversible cognitive drift. But those sanitized bureaucratic terms hide the raw, suffocating horror of living inside a mind that has been tampered with by the state. You become a complete stranger to your own reflection, walking through a life that suddenly feels like a cheap, rented stage set built entirely out of lies. And the worst part of it all isn't even a lingering memory of what they did to you on the steel table. The worst part is the creeping, paranoid certainty that the programming didn't entirely stop just because they finally unlocked the front door and let you walk away. By the middle of the 1950s, the sprawling, unmonitored architecture of Project Artichoke had grown too large, too chaotic, and far too dangerous to keep entirely tucked away in the shadows. Millions of dollars in black budget funds were bleeding into university psychiatric departments, pharmaceutical testing facilities, and clandestine safehouses scattered from coast to coast. Yet, despite the deep classifications and the absolute silence demanded of everyone involved, the machinery of a massive government operation always leaves a wake. Rumors began to circulate among mid-level bureaucrats and military officials who were never cleared for the inner sanctum. Whispers of men and women walking out of government facilities with their memories completely wiped clean, unable to recognize their own families or account for missing weeks of their lives. The people running the program knew that political survival depended on institutional amnesia. As whispers grew louder and the possibility of congressional oversight loomed on the distant horizon, a new kind of operation began inside the very offices that birthed Artichoke. This wasn't about erasing human minds anymore. It was about erasing the evidence that the erasure ever took place. Heavy-duty industrial shredders ran for days in the basements of government buildings, turning millions of pages of classified medical logs, behavioral studies, and subject lists into confetti. Wooden filing cabinets were emptied, burn barrels roared behind secure compounds late into the night, and microfilm was systematically erased or scattered across multiple unlinked archives to ensure no single investigator could ever piece the puzzle back together. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and his inner circle worked with frantic clinical efficiency to sanitize their past. They transferred ownership of properties, closed down front organizations, and severed ties with the academic researchers who had taken government money to perform unspeakable tests on unsuspecting human beings. To the outside world, it looked like the programs had been shut down, abandoned as dead ends of the early Cold War. But in intelligence, true projects rarely die. They merely change their names, shed their skin, and evolve into something darker and harder to trace. Artichoke dissolved into MKUltra, which would later mutate into other, even more compartmentalized operations that adapted to the changing landscape of modern espionage. Yet you can never truly burn away the historical weight of human suffering. Even when every official file is fed to the flames, the human cost remains stubbornly anchored to reality. Survivors who spent decades trying to piece together why their lives suddenly felt like fractured glass began speaking out, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, only to receive heavily redacted, blacked-out pages that looked more like abstract art than government transparency. The paper trail was reduced to smoke and ash, but the legacy of what happened behind those locked safehouse doors carved a permanent, jagged scar into the conscience of the nation. A chilling reminder of what happens when the state decides that human autonomy is just another obstacle to be managed and destroyed in the dark. When you burn a mountain of classified documents, you assume the history vanishes with the smoke. You believe that once the ash settles at the bottom of the burn barrel, the past is effectively dead, locked away where no court, no journalist, and no surviving victim will ever find it. But history has a stubborn habit of haunting the machinery that tried to bury it. By the time the Senate Intelligence Committees finally forced open the remaining vault doors in the mid-1970s, they discovered that Dr. Gottlieb's frantic cleanup crews had missed a vital box, a trove of financial ledgers, unredacted accounting slicks, and administrative memos hidden away in a secondary archive meant for routine destruction. Those surviving pages revealed a staggering industrial scale of human experimentation that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a few rogue agents operating out of a single basement. It was an institutional behemoth, backed by the full financial and legal weight of the United States government. Universities, hospitals, penal institutions, and pharmaceutical giants had all played their quiet, complicit parts in building the architecture of cognitive destruction. Yet, when the documents were brought to light, the response from the establishment was a masterclass in institutional deflection. Careers were insulated, pensions were protected, and the individuals responsible for destroying human lives walked away into comfortable retirements without spending a single day behind bars. The victims, meanwhile, were left holding the broken pieces of lives that could never be put back together. They sat in wood-paneled congressional hearing rooms, listening to polite, evasive bureaucrats speak in dry euphemisms about national security imperatives and unfortunate collateral damage. How do you quantify the theft of a soul? How do you hand down a verdict for a crime where the primary weapon was the targeted, systematic erasure of the victim's own memory? There were no grand emotional reckonings, no dramatic courtroom confessions that brought peace to the sleepless nights. There was only the cold, crushing realization that the state had looked inside their minds, broken the locks, and left them to wander the earth as ghosts in their own skin. What makes this chapter of the Cold War so deeply unsettling is not just the sheer cruelty of what happened behind those locked safehouse doors, but the terrifying ease with which it was allowed to happen in the first place. All it took was a stamp of top-secret classification, a handful of cooperative doctors, and the quiet consensus that individual human dignity was an acceptable casualty in the grand game of geopolitical dominance. The files were eventually dragged out into the fluorescent light of public scrutiny, but the deeper, darker question remained hanging heavily in the air, waiting for anyone brave enough to ask it. If the government did it once, what stops them from doing it again in a form we haven't even learned how to name yet? The files were shredded, the burn barrels grew cold, and the men who engineered the systematic dismantling of the human mind quietly faded into the comfortable anonymity of retirement. To the rest of the world, Project Artichoke became a dark historical footnote, a cautionary tale about the paranoid excesses of the early Cold War, safely tucked away in the past tense. But history is never truly a straight line. It is a continuous loop, and the mechanisms designed to break human autonomy didn't vanish when the budget lines were officially canceled. They simply evolved, adapting to a world where the tools of control are no longer just heavy sedatives and locked safehouse doors, but the invisible currents that shape our thoughts every single day. When you sit alone in a quiet room, bathed in the blue glow of a screen, listening to the hum of modern infrastructure, it is easy to feel entirely safe. You believe your thoughts are your own. You trust that the architecture of your consciousness is sacred, protected by laws, ethics, and the fundamental boundary of the skull. But the legacy of the black site laboratories leaves a lingering, permanent chill over that assumption. It proved that human free will is not an unyielding fortress. It is a fragile, conditional construct that can be rewritten, partitioned, or silenced entirely if the right pressure is applied in the dark. Think back to the first erasure, the quiet room, the ticking clock, the chemical twilight where a man's life was unzipped and replaced with a blank slate. That wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a proof of concept. The state learned that a population doesn't need to be physically chained if their perceptions can be managed, if their doubts can be medicated, and if their history can be rewritten on a whim. The safe houses may have been abandoned, but the blueprint remains active, stamped into the operational DNA of every modern system that views the human mind as a resource to be harvested, rather than a sanctuary to be respected. The true horror of what happened in those clandestine rooms isn't just that the government experimented on its own people, it's that the experiment was fundamentally successful. The boundary between who you think you are and what someone else has programmed you to believe has always been much thinner than you dare to imagine. So the next time you hear a strange noise in the hallway, or catch yourself staring blankly at a wall, wondering where the last hour went, take a moment to listen to the silence, because somewhere beneath the static of everyday life, the architecture of control is still humming. And as the lights go out, you are left to wonder how much of what you call your own mind is actually yours, and how long before someone comes back to collect the rest.